Sarah. So I'm wearing two hats, Artists Union England and Barrack UK. So I've got half the time to sort of cover both organisations. I'm going to try and cover as much as I can in the allocated time. I'm going to start with Barrack UK, Black Activists Rising Against Cuts. We established Barrack UK in 2010, in the summer of 2010, to focus on the disproportionate and adverse impacts of austerity that we knew were coming. So they hadn't come yet, but we knew they were going to come, and we knew that there was a reason to organise and mobilise Black communities. We use Black in its broadest political sense. So we're talking about people who are racialised and migrant people as well. And the reason why we knew that austerity was going to have a disproportionate adverse impact on our communities in every aspect of life is because we already faced discrimination in employment, in service provision, in communities, because of institutional racism, because of direct, indirect, systemic and institutional racism. You know, we face racism in every aspect of life, including everyday racism. But when it comes to public services, when it comes to access actually to voluntary sector services, austerity has impacted on those across the board. So whether it's accessing specialist services in your local community, that could be language services, it could be something pertaining to your particular culture, whether it's getting a foot on the ladder to get into employment, into the career that you want to pursue, or whether it's when you're in employment and you're being blocked and barred from promotion and progression and equal pay and fair pay. Black workers were already facing all of those things. And we know that austerity has gone hand in hand with a rise in racism and a rise in fascism. So you're not only having to contend with the institutional racism that you've got to navigate to access services, to access education, to access a job, you're having to contend with racism on our streets, and people being bolder about how they express racist views because of the rise of fascism, but also with government policy scapegoating and labeling and blaming migrant communities for the lack of housing, the lack of jobs, and so on and so forth. Black people are more likely to live in the poorest areas, the most deprived areas before austerity hit, because of that discrimination, meaning that they're on lower wages because of discrimination in employment. But those are the areas, the most deprived areas of the UK are the areas where there was the deepest cuts to budgets, and that had a knock-on impact on essential services that people rely on. And there is a multiple impact if you are Black and you fall into another equality area, with a particular double impact on Black women and young Black people. So our focus has been on those multiple impacts and looking at racism and austerity impacts through an institutional lens. When it came to cuts that were made to jobs, we saw that Black people were the first out the door. And we saw this also during the COVID pandemic. Black people, migrant workers were the first people to lose their jobs and less likely to be furloughed out on the street and not able to access other jobs. And when Black people lose their jobs, it's more difficult to find another job because of the fact that you face discrimination in the labour market, in recruitment, in employment. So that means that you're driven into deeper poverty. So this has had an impact on you know, whole generations, but particularly if you look at young Black people, the cuts to education, the tripling of tuition fees, then trying to get a foot on the ladder to get into employment, access to housing. We know that, you know, you can't even begin to think about a mortgage for young people at the moment. So a whole generation is essentially wiped out of having access to the life that they want to lead, But when you lose jobs, when you're having to work precariously, there's a knock-on impact on your whole family, your whole community, and the economy of those communities. So that's just sort of a brief overview of how it's impacting on Black communities. And I'm going to talk very quickly, Sarah, if I may, about the impact on members of Artists Union England, my union. Our members are largely self-employed, so they're socially engaged artists, which means that they're doing art projects that serve communities. And sometimes that's in prisons, that's in schools, that's with deprived communities, that's with people with learning needs. Not all artists are selling their paintings for millions of pounds and living in wealth. The vast majority of artists are working precariously and actually having to hold down 2 or 3 other jobs. Our members are a majority of women. If you work self-employed, we were completely left out when it came to measures during the pandemic again, because we weren't fitted into the equation. But if you're self-employed and you've got to pay for a studio in order to develop your practice and keep your arts practice running, as well as pay for a roof over your head, you don't get any childcare support, you don't get a pension, and you're working precariously in other jobs where you're on 0 hours contracts, you're working part-time, you're on the lowest wages, you will be struggling to make ends meet. So what we found when cuts are made, actually things like arts and creativity and culture are the first things to be cut. And that doesn't just have a knock-on impact on the artists that are delivering those services in education or to vulnerable people. It has a knock-on impact on those communities who actually, if you're going through hard times, you're going through cuts, you're going through austerity, you're losing your job, you're experiencing depression, impacts on your mental health, arts and culture become more important. And that means you can't afford big theatre ticket prices, even cinema prices may be too high for you to take your family to the cinema. And actually the arts and culture that's delivered in your local communities, which may be free or very subsidized, means that that's like a lifeline to you, somewhere that you can go for therapy, for support, for networking, for community, and just to enjoy and lift your spirits and impact positively on your mental health of just enjoying some art, enjoying a performance or doing an art workshop and that kind of thing. So it doesn't just impact on the workers, it impacts on our entire communities, it impacts on our mental health and our well-being. And I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.